Okay, here we go. Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, a popular resistance broadcast of hot news out of the region. In partnership with Black Alliance for Peace Haiti Americas team, Code Pink, Common Frontiers, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Friends of Latin America, Interreligious Task Force on Central America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas. We broadcast Thursdays at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on YouTube Live, including channels for The Convo Couch, Popular Resistance, and Code Pink. Post-broadcast recordings can be found at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Telegram, Rad Indie Media, and now under podcasts at popularresistance.org. Today, we have a special broadcast partner, the Mexico Solidarity Project, and we're very pleased that they agreed to support today's episode. The episode today being Mexico's fourth transformation and why the United States wants to stop it. Our guest is Kurt Hackbarth. He's a writer, journalist, and activist, and I'm really very pleased he accepted the invitation to join us for this episode. I think all of you are going to really enjoy and find informative his insight on Mexico. And so let me give all of you a little bit of introduction as to what we're going to talk about tonight. I want to let Kurt lead the discussion on that, but I want to share with you a quote from his recent article published in Jacobin. The article is entitled, "No, AMLO is not undermining Mexican democracy." And that was in response to the electoral council overhaul, or overhaul is maybe even too strong of a word, reforms, and many things that that the Mexican president has reformed since he became president. So let me share this quote with you. I think you'll find it very enlightening. So here we go. Although the 4T has not fulfilled everyone's expectations, it has in 4 years created a governing movement that is taking control of its energy resources, including the nationalization of lithium, and is adopting a role of regional leadership in Latin America. As Kurt says, two sins the United States has not historically forgiven anywhere, and particularly in the global South and Latin America, beginning with the imposition of the Monroe Doctrine 200 years ago. So with that, I want you all to meet Kurt. And so let's start with, maybe we should give the audience a quick informative spiel about what 4T is. 4T meaning fourth transformation. And this is AMLO's project, his vision for Mexico. And I would argue that vision carries over for all of Latin America and the Caribbean, or his hope for other countries as well.
Sure. Well, first of all, hi, Terry, and thanks very much for the time and the space. We got a great podcast, and also thanks to Code Pink and all of the partner organizations that are helping to sponsor today's program. Particularly in light of the attacks Mexico is receiving in the Anglo-American press, it's really, really important that we have the time to discuss all of this today. So thank you at the start for that. So to give a little bit of history, Andrés Manuel López Obrador was elected in 2018 to a 6-year term, and it was his third run for the presidency. There had been a fraud term in 2006 and also a very dirty election in 2012, and things paid off. Third time was a charm, and AMLO won. AMLO is the abbreviation for Andrés Manuel López Obrador, which is very long, right? Won an overwhelming victory in 2018. He won by 30 percentage points over his two other rivals, and his party, Morena, won a majority in both houses of Congress, and that majority was returned in the midterm elections of 2021. Right? I think some of the details are important when you hear some of the critiques about what AMLO's done in office. He has an electoral mandate. He won in a landslide, won both houses of Congress, and won again in the midterm elections. When we talk about the fourth transformation, AMLO is a keen student of Mexican history, and he has identified three other key transformations in Mexican history, what he's laid out. Obviously there are many, but he's highly focused on three. One of them is the independence, when Mexico won its independence from Spain between 1810 and 1821. That was in this framework, the first major transformation, right? The creation of
the expulsion of the first empire.
Yeah, the short-lived first empire of Iturbide, a couple of years. And then, of course, that led to the very turbulent 19th century in Mexico. The second transformation would be the reform era, the reform laws of the indigenous president Benito Juarez from the state of Oaxaca, Zapotec Indian from the state of Oaxaca, where I live, from the indigenous group of the Zapotecs. And the reform laws were key for separating church and state in Mexico and creating a civil service, a civil bureaucracy, laying the groundwork for secular education and such. A very drastic separation of church and state, much more than what's happened in the US, in the sense of all church property was nationalized, all of it, right?
Wow, I didn't.
The monasteries were closed, the churches, everything was nationalized. So it was very drastic, and it had to be, considering the strength the Catholic Church had over Mexican society at that time. That's the second transformation. The third transformation would be the Mexican Revolution of 1910, following the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. And I think, we all have maybe notions of some of the famous actors who participated in that: Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, Venustiano Carranza, Madero, who was the president who was deceived and assassinated at the end of the 10 tragic days. All of that culminated in the Mexican Constitution of 1917, which at the time was the most progressive constitution in the world. And it called for, a great deal of social rights, labor rights, and also the ability to expropriate and redistribute land, right? The Constitution has not always been progressive in practice, but as a document, it's very progressive.
So that was a redistribution of land. Was it successful in 1917?
Well, it didn't happen immediately. The major redistribution was in the creation of the ejido system in the 1930s, right, with in the government of Lázaro Cárdenas, right, where they created large tracts of land for communal use called ejidos. Right? Land use has always been a very, very controversial issue in Mexican history. Many indigenous communities had deeds for communal land that goes back to the colony. They even went back to the King of Spain, right? That they jealously preserved, right? There's a tradition of communal landholding in Mexico. That the second transformation, the liberal transformation, however well-intentioned, was kind of attacked some of the communal landholding with this idea of creating individual landholders, individual plots. Anyway, that would be a whole other program.
Yeah, for sure.
All by way of saying that Mexico
where
has
I
a
lived
tradition
in
of communal
California,
land.
we saw going back to California being Alta California, there's still some of those colonial or those land grants by the Spanish crown that are still being contested. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
sorry,
Zapata and the Mexican Revolution, that was, of course, his big driving issue, was to return the communal landholding rights that had existed previously. Right? So there was land redistribution in the 1930s, the creation of the ejido system, and then in 1938, the nationalization of Mexico's oil reserves. And Saturday, Mexico is going to be celebrating the 85th anniversary of what's known as the Gesta, the nationalization of petroleum under Lázaro Cárdenas, which was instrumental for creating the modern Mexican state. Now, those are the three transformations, right? Independence, reform, and revolution. Then, of course, came the one-party state of the PRI throughout the 20th century. What was supposedly a revolutionary party became institutionalized, corrupted, and then throughout the 80s, I'm skipping a bit,
Okay.
for questions of time, led to the massive devaluation of the peso in 1982, massive nations right throughout the 80s and 90s. Practically the entire Mexican state was sold off, everything. It didn't go as far as Chile, but pretty close.
Yeah.
Trains,
Which was the goal,
lines,
correct?
everything. I'm sorry?
Yeah. Which was the goal
That was the goal.
of those parties
Sell it
in
all
their
off.
administration.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The banks, right? So
Yeah.
it created a whole new class of nouveau riche millionaires on the backs of this parasitical privatization process, which then fed their money back into politicians, the PRI, and then the right-wing party, the PAN, which took control over after the year 2000. And it created this tremendously corrupt kleptocracy. It was a kleptocratic system from top to bottom, right? On the backs of the privatized state, and this Mexico is already a very unequal society. On the backs of the new rich class, which had benefited from these privatizations. Just for example, Carlos Slim, who got the Mexican telephone company, became for a time the richest person in the world.
Yeah.
On the backs of the privatized telephone system and also the Mexico's largest cell phone company. So it was a scandalous, extreme, obscene division of wealth in Mexico. And, as always happens in the neoliberal era, what do you do when wealth is, wealth inequality is out of control? You break out the police, you break out the armed forces, and you keep people down as much as you can, right? So when AMLO talked about the need for the fourth transformation, this is what he was talking about, right? Kleptocracy, only aggravated by two major currency devaluations of 1982 and 1994, plus the so-called war on drugs launched by Felipe Calderon in 2006 with US backing, which has led to, at least 200,000 deaths. So, I mean, we're talking about a degree of suffering, the private the country, two major devaluations, the war on drugs and all the violence that has ensued there. So it sounds like a fairly grandiose term that we're, are going to have a fourth transformation along the lines of independence, the reform and revolution. But you consider it in the context of what the Mexican people have suffered, particularly over the last generation, it's fitting, actually. So that in a nutshell,
it's perfect. You can see how it would resonate.
It would resonate.
And particularly with young people.
Yeah.
And you and I both know, living here, that the young people are pretty excited about this president.
It's, it had gotten to the point in Mexico where even votes in Congress were bought by a system called moches, right? Moche in Mexico is, you share something, right? Mochar, but a system of bribes. So when the government of Enrique Peña Nieto privatized the oil system in 2013, 2014, the Pemex energy counter reforms, the legislators were simply bought off. They were just bought off, right? The Peña Nieto campaign had received money, illegal campaign donations from, for example, the Brazilian construction giant Odebrecht, cash for favors. Then that money was simply used to buy votes. And it had gotten to that point of brazen, obscene corruption, right? And of course, a major media system that made that all possible, right? Two major television stations, Televisa and TV Azteca, a smattering of major newspapers, always on the side of the oligarchy and the elite. What's interesting is that in the trial just concluded in New York of Genaro Garcia Luna, who was the Secretary of Public Security under Felipe Calderon, President Felipe Calderon, in hoc with the Sinaloa cartel. He was in hoc with the Sinaloa cartel. He was found guilty of that. And one of the things that came out in the trial was that Garcia Luna paid media outlets in Mexico for positive media coverage, right? Amongst them, the newspaper El Universal, one of the most conservative newspapers that is always constantly attacking AMLO, the cool figure of some 25 million pesos a month, right?
Wow.
Funneled through, in this case, state budgets. So people knew this. People, they knew the media was bought. They knew that the system was corrupted to its core. Pemex was being leached by a system called huachicol, which is theft of oil along and gas oil along these the ducts that connect the network in the country, right? With people on the inside and people on the outside. What was left of Mexico's public services were being run into the ground. So it's not an understatement to talk about transformation and the need for one.
No, it's almost, listening to you, it's inevitable. It seems. How could it not have been embraced by the public?
It should have happened in 2006, but there was an electoral fraud there that allowed Calderon to sneak in by 0.5 percentage point, and then they, refused to allow for a full recount, and then they went and burned the ballots. Yeah. So, New York Times says there's no evidence of fraud in 2006. Well, they burned the ballots. Maybe if they hadn't burned the evidence.
Literally, they burned the ballots.
They destroyed the ballots in 2006. Yeah.
Wow. Oh my God. Oh, well, no wonder there's, no wonder they're so excited. So with this fourth transformation, what is AMLO's, what are the principal pillars of it for the audience? And then we can talk about why the United States doesn't want to see it succeed.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. The pillars of the fourth transformation are sovereignty. Sovereignty in terms of energy and sovereignty in terms of food, which are the two things you really need to be able to be sovereign as a nation, right? Part of the degradation of Mexico in the neoliberal era was Mexico is, of course, an oil-producing country, but they degraded Mexico's capacity to refine its oil into gasoline. And so they became dependent on US refineries, mostly.
Yes, exactly, with the Venezuelans.
Right, exactly.
The oil's in the ground in Venezuela, the refineries across the Caribbean in Texas.
And that's basically an extension of the whole colonial project of extracting primary, resources, and then
no finished products.
No, right, and then finishing them off somewhere else, and then selling them back, right? Yeah. at extreme market. Yeah. That's exactly what they were doing with Mexico. They would buy Mexican oil, refine it there, and then sell it back as gasoline, which AMLO, I think quite rightly, compared to selling oranges and buying orange juice, right? So you can't be independent as a country if you're not, don't have a degree of independence in energy. And at the beginning of AMLO's term, Mexico had about 5 days worth of gasoline reserves. And then if the United States had decided to turn off the spigots, Mexico would shut down because it didn't have its own, it could attempt to buy from elsewhere. But that in part explains the absolutely servile foreign policy Mexico had in the neoliberal era. Right? Mm-hmm. There was a time when Mexico's foreign policy was quite independent, back in the 60s, supporting Cuba, selling cheap oil to Cuba, taking a leadership role in Latin America. And that all went away in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s in the neoliberal era. Anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, and setting the basis for a Mexican welfare state. So over 4 years, that has included a universal pension for the elderly, a scholarship program, a stay-in-school scholarship program for young people, an apprenticeship program for young people who aren't studying or working, microcredits for small businesses, aid to farmers, and the kinds of fertilizer, foodstuffs, price support, with this idea of boosting food sovereignty, doubling of the minimum wage, up to about 200 pesos a day. It's still low. It's still very, very low in Mexico, but it's a lot better than it was. It's gone up about 20% a year under AMLO. A public option for banking, what's called the Bancos de Bienestar, because, right? Because Mexico's there's about 5 or 6 major banks, all, controlled by foreign multinationals, except for one. So the idea is to create a public option for banking, right? An amnesty law for
That's a huge sin in front of the that's
yeah,
a huge sin
public
in
option
front of
for
the
banking.
US. Yeah.
And it's actually just interesting that a recent move of AMLO kind of slipped under the radar is they told all government departments to close their bank accounts in private banks. Because banks make a killing in Mexico off of, if you pay your taxes in Mexico, you pay it through a private bank, which takes its. And then if a government, you get a payment from a government program, it goes through private banks. So they win on both sides and they get commissions and interest payments there. So there is a progressive attempt to create a public banking network that doesn't depend on, Citibanamex and HSBC and BBVA and, and all of these, right? So that's one of the cardinal sins, right? Closing prisons, increased tax collection. He's fighting GMO corn and glyphosate. The US is really pressing on that one because they're trying to outlaw genetically modified corn completely, but Mexico doesn't yet have enough production on its own to do that totally. Union reform, secret ballot elections for unions. Mexico has a long history of company unions. 90% of Mexican unions are called sindicatos charros, opaque company unions on the side of the employers. So the idea is to create secret ballot elections so that workers can select their own union leaders. That's proceeding slowly, but there have been some notable victories, especially at car production factories over the last couple of years. Reform to outsourcing, that companies can't outsource essential functions. Recall, binding referenda.
So the not outsourcing, that keeps the jobs in Mexico.
Yeah, in the sense of,
is that the goal?
Mexico has been doing what every country in the world's been doing. Instead of hiring people directly, they'll contract out to companies.
Okay.
Benefits.
So not necessarily international, but domestic.
Not international, but in the sense of whatever the core function of your business is, you can't outsource that function.
Got it. Okay.
Still outsource secondary functions to the company, but not because of, as is happening in many places, the outsourcing was a way of getting around paying people, health benefits and pension benefits and, what they're required to do by law. So, and then the big ones, doubling vacation days, and then the energy reform and the nationalization of lithium. It's been a pretty busy 4 years.
That was, so let's start with, because that's probably, and the electoral reform too. Those are probably the 3 things, and even the referendum vote to keep, yes, thumbs up or thumbs down on whether AMLO should continue his term. Those are probably the 3-4 things that the audience is most aware of.
Let's talk about those.
And unfortunately aware of because of how negatively those reforms have been articulated in the United States. And, before we went live, you and I were talking about how this negative narrative pretty started on inauguration day for AMLO. He was so clear about ending the failure of neoliberalism and having to build something else. And for you've been here in Mexico for 30 years, so you've seen a good timeline of his political career and his vision. But for a lot of us in the States, that this was December of 18, there was negative narrative beginning then, and I would argue really took off, amplified fall of 2021, as we were saying in the financial press, particularly in the States, Canada, Western Europe. And in fall of 2021, that was before these big votes, spring of 2022, regarding the reformation of electricity distribution and nationalization of the lithium fields, the referendum for the president, whether he should stay or finish his term or not. And then we've recently seen the INE, Institut Nacional Electoral reforms, which the US media has portrayed as, and your article is so good about this, is just heinously undemocratic. And they're really not anything particularly strong, just kind of a cleanup.
Yeah,
really, of duplicated resources and things that good capitalists would want to see happen in their private businesses. Efficiency.
Supposedly. These good capitalists always talk about efficiency with other people, but when it has to do with top salaries, all of a sudden it's like, oh no, you can't touch top salaries or you're going to chase talent away, right? Which is kind of the argument they tried to use with the obscene salaries they were paying the top counselors at the Electoral Institute. But yes, what I think, first of all, the United States has no leg to stand on lecturing anybody about democracy, right? Right? With gerrymandering, bought elections, people who sit in Congress for 50 years,
Well, it's basically, you were describing earlier, this one-party state between the pre and the con. That's pretty much exactly what exists in the United States right now between the Republicans.
Yes, it is.
Same thing.
Absolutely.
Same model,
and
right?
I think what's really important to understand about AMLO is he created a new party in 2014 called Morena. Morena means Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, or the National Regeneration Movement. But it's a very clever acronym because Morena also means a dark-skinned woman. Morena, right? So the name resonates. And they broke that system apart. Basically, the elite's idea was to have basically pass the ball back and forth between two right-wing parties, the PRA and the PAN. Bounce the ball back and forth. Fortunately, Mexico has public financing for campaigns, and there was a charismatic leader, in the person of AMLO, who started Morena, and all of this is only happening because Morena broke that duopoly. Right? There was another small party, the PRD, which was the left-wing party before Morena, but it had been co-opted, basically. So that's important. That's important to lay out, right? But Mexican democracy, it's like the New York Times and the Atlantic. They come down here, they talk to two rich white people, and then they write an article and leave. And they don't take the time to study the history of electoral frauds in Mexico. They like to paint the INE as this pristine institution that ushered in democracy from above to this passive Mexican public. That's not what happened at all. Democracy has grown in Mexico despite the INE, despite what the INE and its predecessor, the IFE, did in the 2006 election, despite what the INE did in the 2012 election, when Peña Nieto overspent the campaign spending limit some 13 times, which should have annulled the election. There was all kinds of dirty elections, the state of Mexico in 2017, all kinds of scandals when governors from the PRI would divert state resources from state budgets into campaigns, right? This also came out in the Garcia Luna trial. They would divert money from state budgets to buy campaigns or buy favorable media coverages. All these are electoral crimes. The INE never did a thing. They would collect their fat salaries at the top and let all this go on because the INE was part of that whole thing. Be cleaned, right? But this is this idea that democracy comes from institutions with people in suits from above, rather than it being a long-term struggle of people from below, fighting to get fair elections. And then finally, after several tries, succeeding so well in 2018 that they won by a fraud-proof margin. If they'd only won by 2 or 3%, that's stealable. If you win by 30%, well, they flooded the system. They no choice but to accept the result.
That, just as a side note, that I've seen that play out throughout the Americas, and there's a whole series, as the audience knows, a whole series of presidential and legislative elections in the Americas, beginning in Bolivia, fall of 2020, all the way through Brazil,
Right.
Fall of last year. And for progressive and leftist governments, the campaigns were really, really focused on what you just said, winning by a decisive majority, so that the results could not be disputed domestically, challenged domestically, nor could they be challenged in the international press, particularly by the West. And
or by the OAS, right, with Luis Almagro.
Touche.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
More touche. Yes, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Who was the guy who got the whole Bolivia coup underway in 2015, right? And one of AMLO's big foreign policy goals has been to create some form of Latin American cooperation, which would render the OAS, if not eliminate it altogether, which they should, at least make it obsolete, sideline.
Yeah. You know, he was really, and I've shared with you that this was one of my most, regarding the OAS and more democratic regional institutions. An America for all Americans, I think, is what AMLO said in July of 2021, when he gave that fabulous discourse on the 238th anniversary of Simón Bolívar's birth. And I would encourage the audience to listen to that speech. And I think even if you Google it, there is an English translation to. For me, it was the most profound and important speech of 2021 and maybe, you know, of the last 10 years. And it really, and I would argue this is one of the things the United States is, you know, pushing back against now with, you know, the negative narrative. And he really laid out a vision of regional integration, regional cooperation, the obsolescence of the OAS, the importance of Simón Bolívar's vision of the Americas to unite and push back against what he saw in his lifetime happening in North America. And really, I guess I see it this way, or try to explain it this way, that for him, it's not so much the elimination of the United States, because it is an important trade partner, and hemispherically, there's military advantages also. But AMLO really sees the heads of state of the Americas sitting at a round table versus an oblong table with the US, or a rectangular table with the US at its head.
Yes, and we saw that play out in the whole Summit of the Americas controversy this past year, right?
Yes.
Well, very clearly said, that rebellion actually began in the Caribbean, and then, you know, began spreading, right? When AMLO said, you know, the United States can't pick and choose who goes to the Summit of the Americas. It's a summit of all the Americas.
Yeah.
And just very simple, if they leave countries out, I'm not going to go, right? And something as simple as that sent the State Department into a tizzy. You know how to handle this, you know, rank disobedience, because what you're supposed to do is go to the Summit of the Americas, bend your knee in fealty to the United States, and try to, you know, plead some foreign aid out of them. That's the idea of the United States, you know, are trying to get money out of us, right? Instead of what AMLO said is respecting regional and national sovereignty, right? And, you know, the State Department didn't know how to handle it. It was all a very messy thing that spilled over several weeks, right?
It really was
very clumsily handled until AMLO just, you know, didn't go. Others didn't go as well, right?
You know, what was really
great there with their sign with AMLO there at the
oh
summit.
Yeah, no. It was, you know, when he made that statement, I think that was at one of his morning press conference, May 10, exactly, I think, of last year.
Oh,
and I will say we were so very fortunate, and I would just give a shout out to Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, who that afternoon of May 10th did a special edition episode with us to talk about AMLO, his decision to not go to the Summit of the Americas and why that came about. And so we have that episode if the audience wants to share that. But the inference in all of that was, to me, differences aside, we are all right. The cooperation is possible, and just because we have differences as individual countries in the Americas does not mean there isn't space to cooperate and work together. And it
was a teachable moment. Yeah,
it really was. Yeah. And I would say that's for all of us in the activist world too. That we have a lot of differences, but the common ground is what needs to be, the goal. And he really articulated that and personified it.
Yeah,
at that moment and to this day.
And I think that's played out in some of his actions as well. Mexico was kind of seen as kind of a big brother in Latin America because it's one of the largest countries, one of the largest economies, and it's the buffer to the United States. Mexico's got the geographical position of taking all the heat, and we see that right now, right? With all of this nonsense about invading Mexico and whatever else. Mexico has to take the brunt of that heat and pressure from the United States directly. But what do we see AMLO in action? When Morales is deposed in a coup in 2019, he sends a plane and they save Evo Morales, got him out of there just in time. Actually, he probably would have been killed, right? He refused to recognize Juan Guaido in Venezuela, and Guaido has progressively become a laughingstock.
And he invited Nicolas Maduro, the elected president of Venezuela, to the CELAC summit.
To the CELAC summit, yes. The presidents of Venezuela, the president of Cuba, and there was argument, there was debate between the right-wing leaders and the left-wing leaders of Latin America at that summit, but they were all at the same table. They were all at the same table, right? And then you say what you have to say, right? Most recently in Peru, he was very quick to say, this is not right, because the US and the US press all tried to say, oh, well, this was played out by constitutional means. AMLO said, no, this is a coup. And Castillo is illegally jailed. The new Dina Boluarte is a spurious leader, an illegitimate leader, and has repeatedly called out Lisa Kenna, the US ambassador in Peru and former CIA operative, for helping bolster Dina Boluarte. These are the reasons why the US aren't happy. They don't care about Mexico's elections. They couldn't give a damn about the INE. Like they care. They care that Mexico is taking control of its energy resources and that it's adopting a role of leadership in the region of Latin America. And those are two things, going back to the Wolfowitz Doctrine and even before, are no-nos for the US. They just are, right? With regards to the energy reform, Mexico was being bled dry by foreign energy concerns like Iberdrola from Spain, Naturgy, Energies Enel, interests from the United States, who, because of the previous energy reforms, the national grid in Mexico, built over many decades by the Federal Electricity Commission, the public Federal Electricity Commission. Mexico is not an easy country to build an energy infrastructure for. It's very mountainous. The pueblos are very remote. The distances are very long. So for the Federal Electricity Commission to have electrified the entire country was an incredible feat. We're not talking about the Netherlands. We're talking about a very difficult geographic country to connect, right? But then
a huge country.
A very big country.
Geographically large and population-wise large.
Yes, right, 130 million, right? So the energy reforms meant that they had to open that grid to private energy companies who could then use that grid for their own private gain, because then they could create associations of energy, produce energy, some of it green energy, but that energy wasn't going to the public. That green energy was not going to the public. They were selling that energy to Mitsubishi, to Walmart, to car companies, to the multinationals, right? To the OXXO convenience store chain. So it was all an incredible, incredible scam where multinationals were using a whole, discourse of greenwashing, basically, to set up shop in Mexico and make a killing using the public grid, right? Sound familiar? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Cases in the states that have led to terrible blackouts and such. So that's what AMLO reformed. The energy reform law, which US Ambassador Ken Salazar was all up in arms about. Ken Salazar, who spent his life lobbying for fossil fuel interests, only to come to Mexico and try to reinvent himself as this green guru, right? Just study what's done in his life, right? As in Obama's cabinet. What the energy reform law says, it's very simple. Public sources of energy go in the public grid first. And then if we need more, we'll get private energy. They couldn't handle that because that means their guaranteed subsidy was over. Their joyride was over. That was the big thing there, right? And so you see that, Iberdrola is even threatening to leave.
The subsidized, the socialized.
Yeah.
For private profit. Yeah, the socialized infrastructure for private profit. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. And we can see how right AMLO was because, after Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe, what are they paying for energy in Great Britain right now with privatized energy companies, right? What are they paying in Spain with those exact same companies? Iberdrola, in Spain, you get your bill right from Iberdrola, not even from the government.
Wow.
People were out in the streets in Spain protesting energy bills. AMLO was right. He said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to turn into them.
Yeah. Well, and, it's a compromise of sovereignty, of the sovereignty of the domestic population. And without the domestic population being sovereign, there's no opportunity to achieve national sovereignty as a whole.
That's right. National sovereignty is abstract unless you can power your own economy and feed your population. Yeah. It becomes a very practical matter at that point, right?
Yeah.
Countries simply don't have energy resources and they have to get them from abroad. But Mexico is energy rich. Dating back to the colony, Mexico is mineral rich, it's energy rich, it has oil, it has wind in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's got a climate that's very fertile for growing. Mexico is rich in resources. That's why there's so much interest in Mexico. If it didn't have things that foreign countries wanted, they wouldn't care. One of those things is lithium, right?
Right. I was just going to say that. Yes.
Yeah. That's nice trend. My little segue, wasn't that good?
Yeah, no, perfect. Perfect.
In the state of Sonora, dangerously close to the US border, they have one of the largest reserves of lithium in the world in Mexico, together with the triangle of countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, in South America.
And parts of Peru.
And parts of Peru.
Peru, folks.
Yeah.
Peru, where there was just a coup in December of last year. Yeah.
So one of the big reforms was to nationalize lithium, and they're setting up Lithiumix. They're setting up the public national lithium company like Pemex, right? Mm-hmm. And the goal is not simply to sell lithium as a primary mineral resource, but to work together with Argentina, with Bolivia, with Chile to manufacture the lithium, right? Electric vehicles, batteries,
So to develop finished products.
Right. To break with Latin America's peripheral
export.
Yes. To break with Latin America's traditional role as part of the periphery, quote unquote, of just furnishing industrialized nations with raw materials. Right? Yeah. It's a threat to the United States as well. Mm-hmm. The United States is a phenomenon that we're seeing now called nearshoring, where post-pandemic, a lot of Asian countries are relocating to Mexico in order to have access to, the U.S. market, right? Mm-hmm. The United States is all, once they finish their proxy war in Ukraine, they want to pivot and start a war with China. And so they use that saber-rattling discourse in Latin America. You saw the head of the Southern Command who was saying China is starting to control America's lithium resources.
Our resources,
our resources, our backyard.
Yeah, excuse me, your country is sitting on our lithium.
Yes. Can you get your country out of the way? So,
and if you don't, we will.
Yeah. First of all, it's not true that China controls these lithium resources, right? These are these countries controlling their own energy resources, but they don't want to say that. They're trying to frame it that if we don't go in, China will. So it's a recipe for more interventionism.
Yeah. You know, this, I have in our chat, in our live chat, we've got a great question, a couple really good questions I want to run by you. But first,
Sure.
I want to share that last night here in Mexico City, there was a really informative event that the Instituto Nacional de Formación Política, or National
Morena,
Institute
yes.
for Political Formation by Morena,
Mm-hmm.
which, as the audience knows, this is a theme we've talked about throughout the broadcast of this program, the importance of political education and movement building with that education.
Absolutely.
And, the movement building. And so the INFP is doing this, and not just for the domestic population, but for Mexicanos in the diaspora as well, who can vote at their respective embassies.
Thanks to the electoral reform. Thanks to the
electoral reform. Yes, right. And that was one of
the much maligned electoral reform is going to allow millions of Mexicans to finally be able to exercise their right to vote.
To participate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In this event last night, we had the Bolivian ambassador to Mexico did a fabulous PowerPoint presentation on energy sovereignty in our Americas. And he talked about just exactly what you said, from Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Peru, up to Mexico.
Right.
And it was really clear when you looked at his PowerPoint presentation and you know how it was just extractionism, neocolonialism, the profitability of lithium today is skyrocketed. But if you transpose a map of where all the recent coups have been, I would say since October of 2019 in Bolivia, guess where all the coups have been? In the Americas, in all those countries with lithium fields. Every one of them, and most recently Peru in December of 2022. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's really, it's so
It's
clear.
not subtle.
Yeah, it's not. It's just fantastically phenomenally obvious. Yeah.
Well, so, it's, look at the coverage Mexico has been getting. Like you said, the anti-AMLO coverage began as soon as he took office, and certainly years before. But it's just been baldly obvious how it's been ramped up recently, right?
Oh yeah, it's a total I would argue it's basically a media coup attempt.
It's a media coup attempt. It is.
Quite frankly, I don't.
It is.
So let me here. I have a couple questions from Jean, and and Jean is joining us from Central America, and is a really loyal viewer of this program, and I love the comments, right, always, and the interaction. So Jean is asking, what actions does it look like the United States is taking or will take against Mexico to stop all of this? And I think clearly this media coup, but maybe we should talk about some of the most recent articles coming out of the States. And maybe the first and foremost is the heinous one last Sunday in the Washington Post by Fareed Zakaria. Oh my God. I mean, that was, it's a hit. They're hit pieces.
They're just hits. They're just hits. What happens is, I have a piece in Jacobin about this about a year ago. These American think tanks and academic institutions, right? Like the Baker Institute at Rice University or the Wilson Center in Washington, funded by Congress, right? And a bunch of others.
Inter-American dialogue.
Right. They bring together elites from Latin America with, interests in the United States, and they plug them right into media. That's why you keep seeing the same people being quoted over and over and over in these pieces, because they're lazy. They couldn't be bothered to actually want to talk to actual real, people out in the street, right? So what you see is a series of hits, one after the other. And what they're basically doing is just repeating the talking points from the right wing in Mexico and then calling them articles. Now, this is a long-term thing in Latin America. The function of the American media has always been to provide, a microphone for a cast of elites in Latin America. So being true to form, right? And country throughout, country after country in Latin America, that's what the New York Times does. That's what, the Post does. That's what all the American media does, right? They give a voice to the cast of elites.
I would also argue with those think tanks in the media, a lot of ex-office holders on the right wing, specifically presidents, get jobs. I mean, as soon as they're out of office, they're offered jobs at these Washington, D.C. think tanks.
Yep. Either in think tanks.
And most recently, Juan Orlando Hernandez of Honduras and Ivan Duque of Colombia.
Right. They're all just recycled. They're recycled through these think tanks and they're recycled through these university positions, right? Or they're recycled through a corporate board, but they're all connected, right? Felipe Calderon, after office, went to work for a subsidiary of Iberdrola, right? In the same industry he was trying to privatize. Ernesto Zedillo, the Mexican president, after leaving office, he went on the board of, of a train company that he helped privatize, and then, Citibank, which he also helped privatize. So you privatize something and then you get on the board, right?
Right, exactly. Which the prototype for that was the Dulles brothers in Guatemala.
The Dulles brothers in Guatemala, of course.
Yeah.
So to go back to these hits, the hit is that that AMLO is playing right into the stereotype of any moderately progressive leader in Latin America. You have to dehumanize them. So he's an authoritarian autocrat, lover of dirty energy because he wants to take control of the energy. So on one hand, he's an authoritarian autocrat, even though he has a press conference and takes questions from the press for 2 to 3 hours a day. And on the other hand, he's like this mystical fool, right? So during the pandemic, he made a joke at one of his press conferences that he had a kind of an amulet that protected him. The American press was sure that he was talking seriously. So he's a mystical fool who likes amulets. He was over in the Yucatan Peninsula recently. He mentioned this mythical animal called the aluche. A tree. Yeah. The president shared a picture of a mythical being. So the idea is you have to dehumanize, either by painting them out to be an autocrat, an authoritarian dictator, right? Just today in France, Macron is passing a pension reform by decree without a vote in Parliament after they've just been beating a lot of people in the street.
But France is a U.S. ally.
But I don't think they're going to be calling him an authoritarian,
a Western European ally,
threat to democracy, and a mystical fool who likes amulets and aluches. They're not.
Which isn't just a dehumanization of the Mexican president, but it's a complete insult to the people and their culture.
It is.
They're not just attacking one man; they are attacking the entire culture associated with those traditions.
And I think that's a very important point because you have people now like Dan Crenshaw and Mike Waltz who you have the right trying to gin up a use of force resolution supposedly against the Mexican cartels. Then you have the David Frums and the Ann Applebaums who are on this kind of establishment liberal side who have their cause now in the INE, right? But the target is always exactly that, right? It's an insult to the entire Mexican public.
Right.
And even if there's an invasion of Mexico, which there's very likely not going to be, it puts the Mexican American population and the Latin American population in general in the United States at greater risk for hate crime, for illegal search, illegal stop and search, police brutality, entering into houses, illegal detaining, illegal deportation, because the idea now is that Mexicans are now all forcing Americans to take fentanyl, that it's all Mexico, right? Mexicans are literally
But
going
we're
to
not
your
going to
house
talk about
stuffing
fentanyl comes from China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mexicans
Let's
don't
talk
take
about
that.
this fentanyl for a moment, because that is like the latest attack, the weapon that's being used right now. And that's like, yes,
The club of choice, right? Yeah.
Right. That's the, we've had the lithium and the electoral reform, and so now we have the fentanyl, and the fentanyl comes from China.
And it comes from China.
It's not manufactured here in Mexico. It comes from China, and the largest market for fentanyl is the population of the United States, just like the cocaine, and so that is never addressed. But one of the things, and I have to say, this has been very impressive watching the president of Mexico, AMLO, and his team, including his foreign minister, really vociferously push back against this U.S. narrative. And in fact, the Mexican foreign minister is going to be doing a tour of the United States with like 300 stops to talk about what Mexico has achieved in stopping fentanyl and how it is so superior to what the United States has actually done.
Yeah.
So just turning the lens on it. It's brilliant. It's brilliant and super important.
It is important because the idea is to use Mexico as a very convenient punching bag, again, for the 2024 election, like we've seen Mexico be the punching bag before with Bad Hombres and Build the Wall. So now fentanyl and the cartels, right? You'd think that the US would have learned its lessons from the Garcia Luna trial that just wrapped up, right? When you support corrupt governments like that of Felipe Calderon, when you give free rein to corrupt people like Garcia Luna, that creates a problem. That creates a crisis. Instead, they're trying to undermine the very government that's trying to clean this stuff up, right? Everything the US does in Latin America always makes things worse.
Yeah, well, pretty much everywhere.
Everywhere, and more specifically on Latin America in this podcast.
Don't bring us your democracy, please.
Yeah.
Don't bring us.
It's just so short-sighted. Did they want things to continue as they were before? When the Secretary of Public Security was in hoc to the Sinaloa cartel? When the country was rotten to the core back in the Calderon years, right? When the federal police were unloading cocaine shipments in the Mexico City airport, as came out at trial. When members of the Sinaloa cartel were wearing uniforms by the AFI, the Federal Intelligence Agency of Mexico, when they went out to do their operations. That was the degree of symbiosis between the government and organized crime, and the neoliberal era in general, but in the Calderon and Fox governments in particular, which carried on to Peña Nieto. And this is what AMLO was up against. He's been criticized for leaning a lot on the military, but the federal police were totally compromised.
Yeah.
The intelligence services were totally compromised. Right? So I think it's pretty amazing that they've been able to create the degree of welfare state they had in the degree of rot that they assumed, right? When they took office at the end of 2018. Right? And then you see the US deliberately undermining the most important reform effort in Mexico in 70 years, and not only undermining it, but as you say, just absolutely insulting the Mexican public in the process, right? If you read the New York Times coverage, anybody who supports AMLO is silly or bought off by social programs, right? Or just surprised by his messianic ability to deceive people. There's not even...
Well, they use that against Rafael Correa too.
Oh, Correa, anybody.
Hypnotizing the voters. I mean, it's, I would argue that this negative media campaign against the Mexican president and his policies is, and like we were saying, you're not just attacking the man, you're attacking the entire nation and its people, regardless of political affiliation. You're attacking these people, their culture, their language, their ethnicity, everything. When you attack the president, you're attacking the entire nation of people. And in doing that, I believe the US is creating the exact opposite of what the intention is. It's creating a greater sense of what it means to be a Mexican. It's creating a greater sense of nationality in the country and outside the country as well, among Mexicanos in the diaspora. It's creating the exact opposite. And not just here. I think we've seen that play out in a number of countries across the Americas, when the US starts attacking, what you voted for or what the majority of the people voted for. It really, it's attack against everyone.
Yeah, I want to believe that's true. There's a minority of people in Mexico who obviously against the 4T and against AMLO, and that they have every right to do that. But it's a minority, and it's a minority of media interests, like in the United States, that control the television and print media. Fortunately, Mexico has a very active ecosystem of YouTubers. I mean, it's just got really, and that goes back to the time when AMLO was in opposition for so many years, and he was banned from TV. He was practically couldn't be on TV. So very early on, the Mexican left took to social media, took to YouTube, Facebook, and so there's a real extensive network of social media here, which has been very, very, very important.
I know. The current administration is like the example for the hemisphere at how to communicate and communication and using all the infrastructure available. Zoom, Twitter, Instagram. They do YouTube. They do all of it. They do all of it. I mean,
and the Mañanera, his daily press conference, where he just lays it out. He lays it out because direct communication with the public, right? He calls out corrupt media interests, right? People like Lorete Mola, who's created a career out of falsifying news stories and has become a multi-millionaire in the process. No? Now, foreign interests have said, oh, well, you can't criticize these people because then you're attacking the media. No, he's not attacking the person on the street. He's going after a corrupt cast of very super wealthy media interests who were on the take, right? Yeah. Through government publicity money for a long time. So that's been very.
What I find so with these daily news conferences that the president, they're live streamed on his Twitter feed.
Yeah. Twitter, Facebook.
You get like 1 million viewers every morning. And
people wake up to the Mañanera. People wake up,
and they really do listen.
Public life is. That's where these issues are debated every day.
It's phenomenal. Mm-hmm. It's an example for everyone throughout the Americas. It's phenomenal, and it gives. Listening to them, there's several things going on. One, it's not unlike the fireside chats that those of us from the States have learned about with the Roosevelt, the FDR administration. The fireside chats. Well, this is kind of what they are, and but they're an opportunity to inform all Mexican citizens, not just those people that voted for him, about what new policies are being implemented and why, what the president's doing today and why, what happened yesterday, if there was a success, if he got, chastised in the press, he can address it right away in the morning and say, okay, we made a mistake. Here's what we did. Here's what we're doing to fix it. Or, and it's there, but there's also, I think, with all that communication and using the opportunity to educate the public, there is secondarily some enormous political formation going on.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and it's brilliant. It's really a brilliant team that's in place right now.
And it's funny that when AMLO began doing his daily press conferences, all kinds of people criticized it, saying he's going to be overexposed. This idea, this idea from handlers and high-paid consultants that you can't overexpose someone. You have to hold them back in staged appearances, right?
Really curate
set piece appearances, and not too often, and restrict access. This gave the lie to all of that. All of that high-paid, consultants and marketing people, whatever else. He goes out there for 2 hours a day, sometimes 3 hours a day, take questions from anybody.
Right.
And, he'll get into it with someone, they'll get into it with him, right? It's a very free-flowing thing, back and forth.
It's very democratic.
Very democratic. Sometimes people will bring an issue that he didn't know, and he says, "Oh, we'll figure out what's going on with this," and he'll come back the next day. Things happen there, and it's a space for people to realize that politics is not just voting and forgetting about it or going off to brunch.
Right. Exactly.
Well, there isn't
it's
brunch.
Participatory.
It's participatory, and it's consistent, and it's constant, and it's being
every day
in on it. Yeah. And that is because this movement behind AMLO was there from when he won the mayorship of Mexico City in 2000. Then they tried to leave him off the ballot in 2006 to go after him with a trumped-up charge, to strip him of his political immunity and keep him off the ballot. People fought against that. The fraud of 2006, the campaign of 2012. Most people would have given up already. Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas couldn't. He was also cheated out of an election in '88, but that was more or less the end of him. He didn't have this consistency, this persistency, this this stubborn. We're going to keep going at this.
This movement, this Morena movement under him, to help, which is just is crucial to have that base under you,
and a base that's politicized, as you're saying.
Exactly.
Politizado, no?
Yeah.
It's very telling that one of the attacks against AMLO recently was the attack from this ONG in Great Britain, the Index on Censorship, which not surprisingly gets money from the National Endowment for Democracy. And, the director of the Index on Censorship was a former Labor MP that was one of the anti-Corbynites there, right? And so they tried to go after AMLO, calling him Tyrant of the Year over from Great Britain, right? But it's funny too, because these are the same people that destroyed Jeremy Corbyn. They cast around and they cast around. They said first he was a Czech spy, then he was an IRA sympathizer, and they tried to find something, and they finally found something and hammered him into the ground. AMLO is very careful to not let himself be Corbyned, or even
yes, that's true,
right? And the Mañanera in the social media outreach and the politicized base, and this constant going back to media corruption, and also private sector corruption. Corruption of previous administrations. It's important and it's educational. You can't do these things enough.
Exactly. People just, to me, in my observation as an extranjero, people, because of these morning talks, and again, regardless of political affiliation, more and more people relate to him as a human being and see. This is our president. This is our president. Like, you have access. Like you said, this isn't a curated public figure. People have access, regardless of differences, which again, I think AMLO is really great at embodying discourse among people who have different opinions on pretty much everything. He embraces all of it and learns from it, and uses those things as a teaching moment. But more and more people perceive him as, this is my president, my president, because there's that so important relationship building and authentic relationship.
He's in there slugging it out for me every day. That's the sense.
No, it's really, really important. And it's going to be more important every day as this US media campaign against him just gets stronger and stronger.
Ratcheted up. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So Kurt, what points have we not talked about? We've been talking for an hour. I hope that I hope
Oh, it's a pleasure.
I haven't kept you from something. But what have we not touched on before I let you go?
Well, I think a couple things. A couple things. One thing is that AMLO has managed to maintain a popularity ranking in the high 60s or close to 70%, despite a pandemic that has toppled, more than one world leader. Despite this constant barrage of attacks from both domestic and international media, and that's no small thing, right?
Well, coming out of the pandemic too, I think it was last week that we saw the strength of the peso against the dollar.
Well, that was another thing I was going to mention. Perfect.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, no,
it was
very
just
good.
Phenomenal coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah,
and the lack of tourism in Mexico and all the economic fallout. I mean, that's profound. Again, something else the U.S. would not be happy about.
No, it's funny because during the pandemic, AMLO refused to borrow from international, like the IMF and such, in order to allow private companies. And all of a sudden, everybody who's so conservative most of the time saying leftists are spendthrifts, then was criticizing AMLO for not going into debt. It was very funny during the pandemic. Why isn't he going into debt? Why isn't he buying out businesses? Right? Because once you get a country into debt, you've got them.
No. And then there comes the austerity and the privatization of institutions and infrastructure, the whole thing. Everything that he's trying to break.
AMLO's lived through enough devaluations to know that very well. That's also a sovereignty issue for him too, not going into debt. Now, that led him to be particularly cautious with regards to budgets, very low deficits and, keeping very tight reins on spending, which he's been criticized for. And that's fine. I think there's room for a following government, certainly to do a tax reform, raise taxes on the wealthy, and expand, beyond some of the budgetary limits AMLO imposed. But that allowed Mexico to get through the pandemic without going into debt and without a devaluation. On the contrary, foreign investment is up, foreign reserves are up, and the peso has appreciated against the dollar. It's under 18. He inherited it 1920, right? And the biggest attack against AMLO was that, it's going to be devaluation. It's going to be devaluation. No, the devaluation was the previous government's, not this one.
Exactly.
Not this one, right? So that list of social programs that I mentioned at the beginning, the pensions and the scholarships and the apprenticeships, all of these things, it's been done without indebtedness.
Right. Without bankrupting the country, which is always the narrative in the States. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. It's going to, And he's done it. I mean, it's almost, listening to you describe what he's done and how he's done it. And super important that it didn't, take any IMF loans, but that's a whole nother conversation of itself. What the IMF
he was not going to go into that trap. He knows what the IMF he knows what the IMF is all about.
But he basically is socially liberal and fiscally conservative. Balancing the books. I mean, that's where all our, it's very prudent, it's very smart, it's necessary. It's what most family households can relate to, when they sit down and look at how they're going to manage their home for the next week, the next month. It's like, what do we have? What can we do with it? And, everybody can relate to that. That's a very human thing.
It is. I would have liked him to see him be more progressive in certain respects. But I think we have to understand, global South countries do not have the leeway that global North countries do. The United States can borrow, and it has, the petrodollar behind it, and kind of this idea that the United States is always going to pay its debts, although we're getting to the point where we should be seriously questioning that. So, the United States can allow its kind of ridiculousness of the debt limits and, all this ridiculous stuff that they pull in Congress all the time, right? Because they have the international financial system stacked in their favor. A global South country does not have that leeway. It does not have that leeway, It can open itself up to, runs on banks, people pulling out investment, devaluations. So you have to be careful when you're in the global south, when the financial system is stacked against you, that you can't always,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have to,
Well,
you can understand the caution, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a matter of sovereignty again, and avoiding that colonial trap, the banking colonial trap. Yeah, it's very, very important. Let's have, we got one more question here in the live chat.
Sure.
What is Mexico doing about creating renewable energy? I mean, I think solar is a big push for solar here.
Yeah, they just actually opened one of the biggest solar projects in the world in Sonora. There's also some very interesting solar projects, for example, in Mexico City, like on the roof of one of the, I think it's the Ibasos market there, but it's one of the largest urban solar installations. This is a place where Mexico has, a lot of room to grow. Mexico has a very sunny climate, over 100 days a year of sun. So, that's definitely a place for growth there. That said, there's been a lot of unfair discourse against AMLO that he loves dirty energy and he loves, he's a throwback to the 70s and such,
Yeah, that's another thing we're seeing in the US.
Now that Germany is going back to coal, for example, Biden is opening up the Arctic to, that awful drilling project that Biden has been, trying to expand drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. This kind of lecturing of countries like Mexico, which produces 1% of global emissions, whereas the US and China combined produce like 40%, is extraordinarily hypocritical. Part of AMLO's energy reform was to rehabilitate Mexico's hydroelectric resources, which they have a lot of in the south and east, public hydroelectric systems, which has pros and cons. But it doesn't. They're not carbon emitting. So I think the first step was to take more public control over Mexico's energy and stop the bleeding, stop the bleeding of some of these projects and the gaming of the system by private companies, right? And then it's, where can we go on greener energy, but greener energy that isn't being made by foreign multinationals for,
Exactly.
For other foreign multinationals. It has to be green energy that, helps the local populations. For example, those wind projects in the south of Mexico, you've seen them probably in the news, those large wind. Some of the poorest pueblos in Mexico live right underneath those wind projects, and they don't get that wind energy. They don't get them because they're private projects, which pay very little for the leases on those on the lands where those windmills are built. So you think you have to get that straightened out first, otherwise any project is going to replicate a lot of the problems of the neoliberal era, right? There's a ways to go on that, right? And so that's certainly an area. The favorite for Morena for 2024, Claudia Sheinbaum,
is the current mayor and governor.
The current mayor of Mexico City, an engineer, and very interested in projects like that.
Yeah, there was a really good article. I should put that. Well, I want to share with the audience a number of your articles. I'll put them in the program notes. And also there was a recent article, I want to say maybe yesterday, on Claudia and her successes and that she's one of 3 candidates. She's very, very well liked by the young people here in Mexico City. Which is really nice. I mean, it's really wonderful to see a country with candidates that are inspiring and motivating young people to participate in the political process, because that is not happening much, in the States and other countries. So it's really, really great.
And AMLO is really focused on that idea that there has to be what he calls the relevo generacional. There has to be passing the baton to younger political leaders, or the movement is going to continue.
Well, that's the future of the country.
It's the future of the country. And it's also been a problem of left movements in Latin America not doing enough to usher in and create new generations of leaders. And that's why that Instituto de Formación Política of Morena is very important.
Yeah, it's really, yeah. Although I will say, I've gone to a number of events right at the Instituto itself, we live it in person, and most of the live attendees are my age or older, which is really wonderful. I mean, in talking with a lot of the attendees, many of them will say, when I was in college, I never dreamed in my lifetime we would have a president such as Lopez Obrador. And I mean, they're in tears when they share this with you. And most of the young people that participate via Zoom and Facebook, that audience is all younger. But that's so important that technology has been used, because that generation has been born and raised with that technological infrastructure. And so that's all there for them to embrace and participate that way as well. So it's very exciting as someone from outside Mexico seeing the possibilities.
Well, it is exciting. I find it exciting. And I find kind of the silence of the American left on Mexico in general to be finally puzzling, especially at a critical time like this, when
I agree.
Progressive internationalists, this is kind of an all hands on deck moment when Mexico's accelerating the press again. But this, this might be a time to take a look at what's going on. There's some kind of people on the left who say AMLO isn't left enough, and he isn't on, Mexico hasn't had a left-wing government in 70 years, and it's been through hell. It's been through hell. So, let's see things in their historical and geographical context, and also look at actually what's actually being done and not being reported, and also count what any progressive leader in Latin America has to go through constantly, which is this kind of constant media barrage, constant elite barrage. Because make no mistake, I think this is an important point, by questioning the electoral reform like they've been doing in the American press, they're trying to invalidate the 2024 election.
Exactly. They're setting the stage for that.
They're setting the stage for that because they know more.
Exactly. It's exactly what's going on. Yeah.
And that's the coup aspect. That's the coup aspect. They're trying to kind of a color revolution kind of idea. They're trying to indirectly incite the right wing in Mexico to not recognize their, what's going to happen in those elections.
Or the OAS.
Or the OAS, right?
Yeah, don't have the OAS recognize it either. Yeah, no, that I would agree 100% that is exactly what this narrative is about. Yeah, in this moment. Yeah, for sure. So there was one other thing I wanted to ask you. Oh, with just with the US left not focused on Mexico, I wonder how much of that is just failure of those of us from the global north, the United States, particularly, to just almost in a sense, and I don't, almost to not see Mexico. It's a neighbor with a 3,000-mile border. And, we tend to look, okay, what's happening, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Cuba, and Bolivia. And we kind of just hop right over Mexico.
That's what happens.
It's not that people don't, I would argue a lot of people, progressive and leftists in the state, really do not know what is happening in Mexico, precisely because those of us from the north tend to look right over it and go to, and also, and I think that's just an issue of geography and history, unfortunately, which we need to focus on correcting. But also, though a lot of us from the States tend to yearn for something more revolutionary. And these governments in recent years who have changed constitutionally via the electoral process, Bolivia, Colombia, Mexico, and as a whole list of them, that there's a lot of criticism coming from the states about those governments, that they're not leftist enough, they're not radical enough. Well, these weren't hot revolutions. These were electoral.
These were electoral. These were movements that deliberately took the electoral path. Yeah.
Right. And in doing that, you have to, you are now president of an entire nation of people, not just those people that voted for you. Mm-hmm. And we tend to overlook that in the North, I think.
That's a very important point, Terry. Yeah. And I think that has to do with kind of the American or the US, I correct myself.
Yes, you're right.
The US way of looking at Latin America. There's a degree of romanticization of Latin America. There's a degree of exoticization of Latin America. So, I think the US imagination of Mexico is caught up in this idea of, revolutionaries and Pancho Villas and and Fridas, and back nearly 100 years ago, because there's this idea, because Latin America is, the other in the US point of view, right? That it has to be, like you say, a romantic revolution, right? On trains and, with arms and people on horseback with big hats and such. And that almost kinds of exempts people from looking at the day-to-day slog of reforming a country that was on the pretty close to failing.
Yes.
The PRI and the PAN was getting pretty close to failed state there, and bringing it back from the brink.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing to consider is that 70 years of neoliberalism, of corruption, of neocolonialism is not going to be undone and rebuilt by one 6-year presidential term. And that's what this president has. The Constitution allows for one 6-year term. And this is where the movement building, in my opinion, is so important, so that you can, build successive administrations to continue the project, and that you are developing political thought and candidates to support to continue the project. Because the project cannot be, it can be initiated in one 6-year term, but to completely come to fruition, it's going to take much more than one administration. And not just here in Mexico, other countries as well.
And that's why you need to have Moreno winning, consecutive terms.
Exactly.
In Bolivia, it takes that long. I think AMLO was very careful to pick his battles. Certain battles he picked, and he's fought them with everything he's had. Certain things, you can't do it all. So, mining in Mexico is a terrible issue where American, US, and Canadian mining companies exploit, and he hasn't, he didn't go for that. He didn't tackle, for example, as much as he could, the banking system. Although he's doing the public option for banking.
But it's a great start.
And the bienestar, it's a good start. He picked his battles, and he knows he's, been the first to say it. There's a lot to do for the next, for the next government. The good thing is they know exactly what they need to do. It's clear, right? And I think for people who would, everybody should be criticized. But I think if you go back to like a universal pension, doubling a minimum wage, a public option for banking, closing private prisons, fighting GMO corn, union reform, outsourcing reform, recall binding referenda, housing benefit reform, small business help, if the Democrats had done just 2 of those things, people would be thrilled.
The Democrats in the United States.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
They don't do anything.
No, for sure. Anything. Yeah.
So
no, it's an impressive list that you're reading off. I mean, it's impressive.
Doubling vacation days, nationalizing lithium, bucking US on foreign policy. There's some stuff there.
Yeah. And it's made, and it's made many people in Mexico very proud. Particularly with AMLO pushing back against the US narrative. I mean, that's quite something for people to see. And
what is it? Because it's humiliating if the US bullies you and your president just lets it go, which was the norm for the last 30 years. right? Just kind of
Yeah.
meek, submissive.
Well, yeah, we're basically, an undeclared state of the US in a way, like subservient to the states. And no, it's really, it's really important to see that pushback, and not just by the president, but by his communication team. And as we have seen the last few days, by his foreign minister as well, which is.
And that's important. And they're getting the consulates involved.
Yeah.
Of what Obama did when he went to the US is he got all the consuls together. You know? Because one of AMLO's
to control their narrative in the pushback.
Well, to get on the same page, right? To get on the same page. One of AMLO's big pushes in the 2018 campaign was to use consulates to advocate for immigrant rights in the US. And this is a good time to do that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, when you have a US senator threatening military invasion of your country, that's not a light thing. You can't ignore a statement like that, even considering where it came from. You just simply can't ignore a statement like that. That has to have a very strong response to it.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's, you have to be measured, because sometimes, who's Dan Crenshaw? I mean, who's Mike Waltz? Who are these people? They're trying to find their 15 minutes of fame, and they've latched on to the Mexican issue, right? So you don't want to inflate them out of proportion to who they are, but also you don't want to let it go, right?
No, you can't.
Graham's in the Senate. He's in the Senate. One day he wants to bomb Mexico, and he wants to bomb Russia because of the drones. I mean, he's making himself look ridiculous. Like he wants to show everybody somebody different every day.
As a Mexican citizen, that's a heinous thing to hear.
It's a heinous thing.
I mean, I don't want to see any more wars as a U.S. citizen either. Certainly none led and financed by the United States. But my God, when somebody in the U.S. Senate is threatening you like that, that's
not only is it, offensive and humiliating, and all of that, it emboldens far-right movements in Mexico, and that's something that can damage over the long term, because. Yeah. It feeds into rhetoric that AMLO's a dictator, that AMLO's not, everything they say that nobody believes, average Mexican doesn't believe, is all of a sudden they find repeated in the American press. Mexico's a failed state, Mexico's a narco state, Mexico's out of control, right? This feeds the far right. It's just absolute fuel for the far right in Mexico. And that's damage that lives on far, after once Lindsey Graham's moved on to some other stupid idea, or Dan Crenshaw has, faded into oblivion, right? That emboldening of far right interests in Mexico and in Latin America, that remains. That's
the color revolution, setting the narrative, the stage for that. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, well, listen, is there anything let me just see if there's any more questions.
Yes, if there's any other questions.
Because we've had a really terrific interactive chat tonight, and I just want to make sure that we've asked it. Yeah, I think lots of questions, but your comments in our conversation have answered pretty much everybody's concerns. So, and a lot of shouts out to you in the chat, Kurt.
Oh, well, that's thank you.
Got a lot of fans watching tonight.
Well, thank you, everybody.
People really, really excited that you agreed to be our guest this evening. And I should also say a number of comments thanking you for the information and helping them understand the U.S.-Mexico relationship much more clearly.
Well,
and the success of the president here. So,
I think this would be a great time to take a look at what's happening in Mexico, take a look at what's happening with the Cuatro T, and also to take a look at what's happening in the Mexican community in the United States. There are 40 million people of Mexican descent in the United States, and
so get to know your neighbors.
Well, curious about Mexico because there's some interesting things going on, and I think what you said before was interesting. It's like there's so close, so far kind of phenomenon. Mexico's so
yes,
but on the other hand, it's so far, and attention tends to jump to other areas, right? But people within the United States can do so much to push back against this bilge, right? This bilge from David Frum, who helped lie us into Iraq, and his editor at the Atlantic Monthly, Katzenberg, who helped lie us into Iraq, or Fareed, who helped lie us into Iraq, right? These people have regime change in their blood, and they see Mexico as a caricature that can just be, run over, like a toy train, right? And between, America's U.S. pivot from Ukraine over to China, kind of sweep Mexico in the process. It's most likely not going to happen, but it's very easy to see how when the United States is so unstable at the moment, and banks are closing, and people are upset, and there's a lot of, unhappiness and social, things aren't going well in the US, and the US's global role is shrinking. And the US has a great deal of difficulty accepting that we're entering a multipolar world and it can't call all the shots anymore. It's flailing around.
Exactly.
Out of control. And it wants to hit here, and it wants to hit there, and it wants to shoot there, and it wants to shoot over here.
It's making it the country
where anything could
dangerous.
Happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Do I think they're going to bomb Mexico tomorrow? No. Do I think things could escalate because the conservatives have their enemy in the cartels and the quote unquote liberals have their cause in the INE? Yeah, things could, and if not tomorrow, they could use it to make things more difficult for a next Morena government or a next one. These people always have a strategy. Destabilization is a long-term strategy for these people, right? So if it doesn't happen tomorrow, they'll try again next year, and try to build on what they've already done. All of this is by way of saying that anything people can do in the States, comments and these articles, letters to the editor, speaking up, speaking out, it's invaluable because as of now, the right wing has had the run of it with regards to AMLO. Everything about AMLO in English language press has been negative, except my articles and a few others.
Touche.
Everything has been only negative and uninforming.
Yeah.
So even the smallest pushback against this narrative is more than there has been already. And it's important. When Medea, did what she did at the Summit of the Americas, that circulated.
Yeah.
When people, stand up for Mexico's sovereignty and Mexico's right to its own democratic path, that resonates. Yes. And it puts these, New York Times, Atlantic, Washington Post, thing after thing, puts them in their place because these people come down, they hang out in Mexico City, they hang out in the wealthy parts of Mexico City, they talk to the same people, right? They have their expense budgets and they leave.
And exactly. Yeah.
That's what
they do. They don't go to the north side of Mexico City and ride the new cable bus, the new cable car, the public transportation system up the hillside, and see the enormous benefits of project.
There are now 2 cable lines going up into the hills.
Yes. One in the east and one in the north. And they connect right into the existing subway metro system terminals. It's really, imagine that public transportation that actually is efficient and easy to use.
And cheap. The Mexico City Metro is 5 pesos. It's the equivalent of 25 cents.
Yeah.
It's a miracle.
And really easy to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they don't see those sort of things. Okay, so all looking with the audience, Kurt has just shared with you your activist assignment from this episode is to use your voice, to counter this anti-AMLO, anti-4T narrative in the US media. And again, it can be quite simple as just getting in the comment section of an online post. And you could even try to get an op-ed piece published, which would highly, but even those small little things do get read, and they are influential. So that's the activist assignment, the call to action for tonight's episode. So maybe we should end there and thank the audience for joining. We had a huge audience tonight. I'm so thankful to all of you and your interest in what is currently happening in Mexico and sharing your time with our guest. And also I should thank our all of our broadcast partners. So let me pull up the list so I don't forget any.
Oh yeah, definitely. Mhm.
First and foremost, we want to give a shout out to the Mexico Solidarity Project, who was our special broadcast partner this evening, and Kurt and I are both involved with that project. And our weekly partners include Black Alliance for Peace, Haiti America's Team, Code Pink, Common Frontiers, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Friends of Latin America, Interreligious Task Force on Central America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas. And again, we are a popular resistance broadcast, so in partnership with 8 other organizations. So it's a wonderful coalition, and we're really thankful that the broadcast has grown to such a great activist coalition. And so,
Yeah,
so Kurt, thank you so much for your time. Extraordinarily generous of you to have such an extensive conversation, and I hope we can do it again. And for the audience, if you've missed some of this, you can rewatch it on YouTube and or listen to the conversation on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And also, I should say, we will rebroadcast this episode next week, Thursday. What is that? The 23rd. On Code Pink Radio. Kurt and I have been asked to do a guest episode on Code Pink Radio, which will broadcast Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern on WBAI out of New York City, WPFW out of Washington, D.C., and a number of other Pacifica radio stations throughout the United States, which, we're thrilled for that invitation to be.
And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Kurt Hackbarth. Not just, for my own vanity, but because
no, I've shared it in the chat multiple times, but please.
I'll be in Mexico City on Saturday, as you'll be, Terry, right?
Yep.
There's going to be a mega meeting, mega rally by Morena and AMLO on Saturday to celebrate the 85th anniversary of the expropriation of petroleum. And it should be a very interesting event.
It's going to be exciting.
Morena shows its muscle out on the streets because a lot of people go. I mean, just, any old rally. At the last march with AMLO in November, they said 1.5 million people went. So
people were so excited about that. Oh my gosh, all the social media live streams and stuff, people were just, was enormous excitement. Yeah. And then of course the US spun that as, as the Mexican government paying people to attend. Of course, right? Yeah. So much. Yeah. It's so crazy. So, okay. Well, I'll see you Saturday, and hopefully we'll see you back on our program to continue this conversation about the 4th transformation here in Mexico. So, thank you so much for your time, and really just a pleasure to have this opportunity to work with you. Very much.
That's great. Thanks, Darren. Thanks.
Okay.
Everybody.